Furious Driving, proud to be supported by Diamond Bright, protecting, cleaning and caring for the Furious fleet and for yours, with 10% off using code FD10. Follow the links in the description below. Hello and welcome to Furious Driving, and you join me today here in Sleaze, the 4.6 litre Rover P6 V8. But we're not talking about Sleaze today. You know, today's not a Sleaze day. Today is not a day about classics of the past. Today is a day about classics of the future. The classics yet to be. Because yes, like the video we did a few weeks ago talking about potential future classics, which are not necessarily about cars to invest in financially, but cars to invest in with the heritage of the motoring world around us, as well as maybe a side helping of these ones might go up in value, but more about what's going to be interesting, what's going to be considered a classic in the coming years. And I say this as a caveat because please don't take my advice on anything financial. You're just definitely on hiding to nothing if you do. And last time I did bring up and suggest a number of cars which I think are interesting and different and just are going to stand out at car shows. If you turn up at the Festival of the Unexceptional or the NEC Classic Show in 2035, what are people going to stop and stare at and point and take photos of? What's going to be the Instagram star of tomorrow? Well, here maybe, gazing into my crystal ball, are a few ideas of what we might find. So, now first of all I will say, I think I did reasonably well with my first guess, because at Festival of the Unexceptional this year there were an awful lot of Ford KAs, and that's something I did suggest was an up and coming future classic, something that people are going to latch onto and think are interesting. I'm still hoping Fiat Puntos become interesting. They're 30 years old this year, but there still isn't much buzz around them, which I find frustrating because they're absolutely brilliant little cars. So I'm not going to recommend the Fiat Punto as a future up and comer. I get loads of comments on mine whenever I see people out and about in it. People are always fascinated by it and people love it. My criteria, as always, are cars that are interesting, cars that are going to have reminiscence value. They're going to have the rose-tinted glasses effect working on them because people had them as first cars or their parents had them, or cars that are technically interesting, and that's going to have like an engineering slant. Things like the P6 I'm sitting in right now, that kind of ticks every single box. It was the first European car of the year. It's a technological masterpiece. It's a really, really interesting car under the skin, and for a long time, whenever I drove anywhere in a P6, someone would say to me, my dad, my uncle, my neighbour had one of those. There's loads of memories of these cars. I mean, that's, as they get older, these things are now like 50 plus years old. That's kind of happening less because the people who remember them, well, aren't out and about quite so much maybe. But those are the things we're looking for. So without further ado, as I believe is the law in this kind of listicle situation on the internet, let's start with 10 more ideas for cars that might become future stars. And first of all, this might seem obvious to some, might seem not obvious to others, the Micra K11, which is the second generation Nissan Micra. The first generation Micra, already old enough to be a bona fide, definite, it's a real classic kind of a situation. No one's going to doubt a car from the 1980s. It's pretty much classic territory. But the K11, that's very much a car of the 90s, into the noughties in fact, and it looks surprisingly modern still. It's kind of in that position now where it's falling out of the old person's last car and into the young person's first car kind of area of car life, because well, that's just the situation they're in. A lot of old people bought them as a last car because it was that kind of car, but now a lot of younger people are buying them because cheaper insurance, cheap to run. So there's lots of nostalgia. Maybe it's your grandparents had a car and now it's your first car. That kind of nostalgia thing is really working hard for that car, and it's a cute looking little thing as well. And couple that with the fact it is basically unbreakable. Apart from rust, you're going to struggle to stop a K11 working at all in any respect at all. The interior is tough, the engine's unburstable, and they're built in Britain as well. So you can join both British car clubs and Japanese car clubs and go to both of those shows, and people can't technically argue on either front. And if you want to get a bit exotic with that car, there's also the March Convertible, which is a Japanese only car, but you can probably find one and import one if you're really of a mind to do so. And they're made from 1982 until I think my writing says 2003, but I did scroll that one number. Looking around on the internet today, they're ranging from around 500 quid to about £2,000, so not going to break the bank unless you go for a motorsport modified one. And a surprisingly large number do seem to be motorsport modded. I guess there's a category that they fit into. And those ones cost quite a lot more, unusually. Normally the modified ones cost less, but not in the case of the K11. So yeah, I would definitely say the K11 is up and comer because just so much nostalgia. And if they don't rust away, they'll still be here. Now next up, number 2 on the list, is going the other way. This is less of a nostalgia wagon because people don't seem to remember them quite as much, but definitely interesting from a technical standpoint. We've got the Skoda Felicia. Felicia? Take your pick. From 1994 to 2001, this is Skoda's small car. Now, it might not be very exciting because you think, well, it's just a little kind of polo-like thing. But no, this is quite an exciting thing. We did a review of this one a while ago, and it was really well received because people were very, very fascinated by it. It was the last car that was built on a platform that was developed by Skoda independently, but also the first car that Volkswagen had input on. So as they went on, they got more and more Volkswagen bits in there, and Volkswagen really kind of upped the Skoda game in terms of quality, but at the same time it had that kind of unique Skoda character. So it's a really interesting car, mixing the best of both worlds in a small car, which is quite a fascinating little thing. It's basically sub-1,000 pound motoring, because they are fascinating in that respect. The technical and historical aspect of it, it makes it an interesting future classic if you want to have a car that's a landmark. But in terms of nostalgia, there isn't a great deal for them. People don't generally seem to jump, oh, I remember the Felicia. I can't remember how to say it. There's lots of choices in the range. You've got air conditioning, you can have velour, you can have a pickup truck. And there were almost none available to buy on the internet today. I was going to say the Skoda Favourite as an entry on this list instead of the Felicia, but the only one I could find for sale to get any kind of guide price was one at KGF Classics, and it was £5,000. No, £6,000, my mistake. So yeah, they kind of ruled it out on that one. I figured the bubble, if it's £6,000, the bubble's already burst. Right, now, this is a return to the photo rule of thumb of, is it an up-and-coming classic because suddenly there are lots of them at photo, and this time there were. I thought I saw several, as many as several, Peugeot 309s. This is on the cusp of being too late to grab a bargain before the bubble goes up. And this is the car that's on the cusp of being too late to go and jump onto, because looking on Auto Trader today, there were only 3 for sale, and one of them was a GTI for 13.5 grand, which I don't think is a bargain anymore. But mostly the regular cars are not strong money. I test drove a real base model Survivor that was lovely recently, and that was for sale privately for, I think it was a matter of hundreds of pounds. It was like a grand and a half tops, I think it was. There's some really nice ones in Auto Trader for about about 3,000 or 4,000 I think at the moment, so they're going up a bit, but they're still not big money. The thing about the 309 is it lived in the shadow of the 205 forever. It's always been the also-ran in terms of classics and things, but I've always kind of preferred the look of the 309. And it's slightly ungainly from certain angles, but I like that kind of longer look. It's an interesting car. Again, it's got historical interest, bit of nostalgia because people did have them as, you know, cars to drive in and do car stuff for quite a long time. But it's another historical landmark position, because a last of becoming new of, because it should have been the last ever Talbot. I mean, they weren't planning on it being the last ever Talbot, but it was the car that was being designed when Talbot kind of ceased to be, and it was going to be the Talbot Arizona. But it was already part of the big Peugeot empire at that point. It's a complicated story. So it was based on a 205 platform that had been stretched a bit, and part of the design brief was it had to have Peugeot 205 doors, which is why the doors are a slightly odd fit in that big long chassis, and that rear tailgate with the huge glass, that's to kind of make it fit around those doors as well. So it's a fascinating car technically and historically, and I think, especially in GTI form, I think it drives better than the 205 because the longer wheelbase gives it a bit of the edge, and it's a lovely sort of 1980s look. I think they're great looking cars, and it's a car I would not say no to having in the garage here at all. In the live chat on the weekend, someone said, would I have a French car, and I've forgotten the 309. I'm as guilty as everyone of forgetting the Peugeot 309. My bad. Everyone forgets 309. Don't forget the 309. They're brilliant. Go and buy one while they're still cheap. Okay, now this, number 4 on our list, this is an entry which continues to fall in value by the day. And this is a car that's been unfairly maligned since day one. People called it a posh Mondeo, and that was just so unfair because it was so much more than that. The Jaguar X-Type is only 19% Mondeo, even though it's based on the Mondeo floor pan and sort of substructure architecture. There is very little Ford in it, and it was completely worked over by the Jaguar design team. It's coming from the time when Jag was owned by the Ford's Premium Automotive Group. Jaguar had never had a compact executive car to fight in against the 3 Series, the C-Class, that kind of category of car, and they wanted in. So the best thing they could do was to come up with their own, and they used the Mondeo platform because it's a brilliant platform, but they re-engineered it to be a all-wheel drive platform using a viscous coupling. And it's a great looking car. Jeff Lawson, I think it was, designed it. Beautiful job, very nice retro styling, which may have hampered it a bit at the time. Rover were doing the same kind of thing, and some people loved it, but it was a bit of a fad that kind of died out, and maybe it made it look a little bit dated compared to the very modern looking German rivals. But it's a great looking car. The interior is fantastic, and also they brought out a year after launch the first ever Jaguar estate car as well. And it's such a shame that after such a short time Jaguar are abandoning estate cars again. When the XE goes, I think that's going to be the end of their estate cars, and they'll be SUV only, which is a real pity. The problem with the Jaguar X-Type now is that although it's a fantastic car, all-wheel drive option, front-wheel drive option, petrol, diesel, V6, loads of great engines, lovely interior, but they rust. They rust catastrophically. If you can find one without sill rot, it's probably got hiding sill rot that you haven't known about yet. You'll pay a little bit more, something of a premium, but there are loads on eBay for under £500. And bear in mind, this is a Jaguar, 2001 to 2009, so not even very long ago. I saw one on eBay for £200 because the chassis that the subframe bolts onto were gone, and it needed lots of welding because the rust is just killing all of them. They're brilliant, but find a solid one is your challenge. But if you can find one with rust and an MOT, you can drive it for no pennies until the MOT runs out, if you want a chance of your luck. Don't crash though, if you take my advice. Right, now sticking with the retro theme, but this is kind of retro futurism from the beginning of this millennium. The Audi TT, this is a beautiful car. It looked like it landed from a spaceship, as the cliches go. It was a really, really beautifully forward-thinking design. It looks like 1950s idea of the year 2000s motoring would have looked like. It's fantastic. And it does seem to be the YouTuber car of the moment, with loads of channels seem to be adopting broken Audi TTs. Now they're 25 years old nearly. There's lots of semi-dead ones around to pick up. So basically, it's a more manly Beetle, if you want to put it that way. But it's still a Golf underneath. It's a gorgeous concept car looking thing. The interior is fantastic, especially if you get the baseball mitt stitching on it. Looks fantastic. You've got all-wheel drive options, you've got a couple of different engine power options, you've got the cabrio option. They're ULEZ compatible. If you get, I think all of them are actually, they're maybe after a certain point, but mostly they're ULEZ compatibles. You can find nice ones for around £5,000. They don't seem to have massive problems with rust, but you've got the usual early noughties Volkswagen problems with electrics and things being fragile in that respect. But yeah, lots around for very little money. If you fancy a project, I mean, I quite fancy one as a project myself. There's no reason not to. I mean, if you look how easy the Beetle was to work on, it's the same kind of thing, but you might find you've got the same rust spots as the Beetle as well. So, be warned. Yeah. Moving swiftly on. Now, I won't often recommend an SUV. That's the end of the sentence. I won't often recommend an SUV. But the XC90, the original XC90, is kind of too good to ignore, unfortunately. And it's too much of a bargain to ignore, really. And as Volvos have such an almost religious following to them, they're going to start coming back in value at some point soon. The way that the V70s and the 940s and the 740s have, it's going to be a popular car in the future. Looking back, it was Volvo's first ever SUV. They did a concept reveal a year or so beforehand to kind of gauge interest in the thing, but I think they already made a decision to launch it at that point anyway, because SUVs, end of the 90s into the beginning of the noughties, were becoming a big thing, big part of manufacturer portfolios. Clarkson actually owned several of them because at the time he said they were the best cars ever. Now he's moved on to a Range Rover again. But it is typical Volvo. Clever touches all across the interior, neat styling, and interestingly, although it's 4.8 metres long and how wide is it? 1.9 metres wide, they don't look huge compared to modern SUVs which have got a bit more bloat on them. I don't know, they've got that kind of estate car look even though they're jacked up in an SUV format. I can almost forgive it for being an SUV. You've got lots of engine, inline 5, inline 6 on petrols, you've got a 2.4 diesel, there's also a 4.4 litre Yamaha sourced V8, which is very much the thing to have. Unfortunately, fragile automatic gearboxes do kill a lot of them, and an awful lot of them were automatic as well, so my advice for everything in life is go for the manual. In this case, it is actual consumer advice, not just my own bias. Pick up an early one now for under £3,000. That's a good runner. You want a project, look at £1,000, 1,500 quid, maybe even under £1,000 for a project. And that is an awful lot of car, an awful lot of Swedish goodness for very little money indeed. Now moving on again. Now this is a bit more proper classic territory, but a slightly overlooked classic, which I think this year might get a bit more interest. People might start to notice at last. Mercedes 190. This is the E30 rival you forgot you'd forgotten. Sub £5,000, most of them, which is sort of £4,500, £5,000 for the good drivers, which are very, very presentable. That gets you into a really, really nice example. There are some sort of 10,000-ish ones out there which are, you know, immaculate, and of course there's the Cosworth mega performance ones which are silly money, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the everyday cars. It's the car that went up against the BMW back then, and everyone loves and remembers the E30 because it's got the great handling and everything, but people forget the E30's got an awful steering rack, way too many turns lock to lock unless you get the IS rack, I think it is. But this one, you've got that wonderful Bruno Sacco design and that classic Mercedes look on the inside and the outside, and it's the tail end of the indestructible Mercedes era, so you get pretty decent build quality still. There were 1.87 million built mostly in Germany. Mercedes spent £600 million developing the thing, so it's really well thought out. It's got stuff like the 5-link rear suspension that was used in later E and C classes. Later cars have got airbags and they've got ABS as an option, so it's loaded with safety and good driving. It's a brilliant car and it looks so good. It's a little bit discreet perhaps, but I think they're fantastic, and I'm sure that they're going to start rising up. So this is the W201 for number nerds, and they built it from 1982 to 1993. But look at the values of things like the W123, which was the E-Class, which is sort of running sort of semi-concurrently. Those have just absolutely leapt in the last couple of years, and the 190, I think, can't be too far behind, because people can't afford the 123 anymore. They'll start looking to the 190, the W201. It's definitely one to watch, and one I would quite like as well. So lots of engine options, gearbox options, all kinds of different options on these things, and lovely looking cars. From the 80s to the noughties for a very much a future classic. This is one to buy and stash at the moment. We've done its rival stablemate, the Mini R50, in the previous list, but designed by the same man, Frank Stevenson, was the Fiat 500. Now this is a very new car for the list, bear in mind it only came out in 2007, so the oldest ones aren't even 20 years old yet. But this does tick the nostalgia boxes very heavily, because built 1 million of them in the first 5 years or so. They're just flying out the factory doors like crazy. They are absolutely everywhere and they are dirt cheap. But how many people have had it as their first car? I know about 3 people whose kids have got them as first cars at the moment. People love their first car. People always look back to that with fond memories. And so that's something that makes a future classic. Lots of people too young to drive, their parents have got that. And so they're going to remember going to school in that car, being taken to the shops in that car. So that's got lots of memories as well. That's where nostalgia comes from. It's also a fantastic design with loads of sort of 50s retro throwback design touches, like the colour-coded dashboard inserts and radio and that kind of thing, which makes it look like a 50s car, even though it's obviously a 1990s car. The 1990s is a thing. With so many available, and now they're hitting that sort of hitting the 20-year low in a car values, there's never been a better time to buy one, because there are so many. You can take your time, pick the best one, and there are lots for under £1,000 right now, and that's a modern car. It's not rusty yet. Looking on Auto Trader today, there were 4,444 Fiat 500s for sale, so you can pick whatever spec you want, you can get whatever age you want. But if you're looking for a future classic to stash, if you've got room to hide a car behind a barn and have the best of the best, now is the time to buy one of those. It's fascinating, I think, that Frank Stevenson designed 2 of the biggest selling small cars in the world that were on sale as rivals. But now is the time to buy one, because they will never be cheaper. Right, closing in on the last couple of cars on our list. And I'm looking very much to the far future here with terms of nostalgia, because as 2030 approaches and the zero emissions yada yada, hybrids are now pushing 30 years old. I think it's time we start looking at hybrids and EVs as future classics, because people are going to remember them at some point in the future. And the first, well, it is the first, because the original Prius, the XW10 model, arrived in 1997, so that's 27 years ago. Nearly 3 decades. That's a long time to get used to things. It was the world's first production petrol-electric hybrid. So lots of pioneering technologies, not just a new design, it was a new concept, it was a new way of getting about. And Toyota ridiculously over-engineered it so that it couldn't fail. So they knew they had to under-promise and over-deliver. So if you talk to Toyota's engineers and people, they know, or they knew, that the car could do so much more than they ever admitted to or promised to the world, because they knew if they failed, it would be the end of hybrids right out the door. So they only promised it would do a little bit of what it could do, so it would do it perfectly, and it'd be so well within its capabilities that it was never going to fail, which is kind of clever if you like. It's disappointing in some ways, but clever in other ways. But the concept worked, and it found instant homes all around the world, not just with kind of the ecologically minded people who wanted to move on to the next generation of motoring. People who drive for a living, just going around the city all day long, taxi drivers, delivery drivers. I mean, Uber wasn't a thing yet, but there were still people making deliveries and there were still people driving minicabs. They loved it because the running costs were so minimal, because the petrol engine only ran half the time, or less, depending what you were doing. So yeah, it's a fascinating concept, and the first of the first. And I think from that kind of first aspect, there's room for it to be a classic of the future. And the first Prius is almost completely forgotten. I'm sure you've looked at those pictures and thought, well, that's not a Prius, is it? That's something else. Because the first generation is almost forgotten. Only ran for 3 years. It was designed in California, built in Japan, did what it was meant to do. It started the ball rolling. That was the first hybrid. GM's first hybrid was the EV1, and it put GM off EVs and hybrids for many, many years. But they came back in 2011 with a really interesting car called the Ampera, or the Bolt if you're in America. But it was the Vauxhall, the Opel, the Holden, the Chevrolet, also the Toyota Volts apparently. Only ran for 4 years though, 2011 to 2015. It's a range extender EV. Technically it's a plug-in hybrid because you can plug it in and drive up to 40 miles on the battery without ever turning the engine on. So it does count as a plug-in hybrid. But it's a very, very interesting concept because it's got a 1.4 litre petrol engine. It's an Opel O family engine under the bonnet, but that's not connected to the wheels. All that does is drive a generator which creates electricity to either recharge the battery or drive the motor, I think, directly. It's fully electric motivated, but with a petrol engine to repower it. And so you can drive as far as you want to drive as long as your petrol tank's full, and you can refill anywhere. The point of it was, back in 2011, running an EV wasn't as easy as it is today. I mean, it still can be a bit of a bind trying to find somewhere to charge up and beating the queues for the chargers and whatever. Back then, finding a charger at all could be really tricky, especially in places like America where there's hundreds of miles between any charging, and Australia are even worse. So this is like the gateway, the entry point, the stepping stone, if you like, into EV-age. And Bob Lutz from GM, he was like a visionary motoring leader. He led the project, and it was apparently against huge internal opposition from GM because of the fiasco of the EV1. It wasn't a huge seller, but it is definitely a cult car. There are Facebook groups, there are owners clubs all around the world. People who've got them love them. As I say, I only do 40 miles on its electric only range, but for most people, if they live at home, obviously live at home, drive to work, generally that's less than 20 miles away for the majority of people. So you can plug in at home and recharge and go to and from work or to the supermarket and never have the petrol engine running. So it's a nice, easy stepping stone into electric motoring. Incidentally, the electric motor has got 149 horsepower and 370 newton meters of torque. So it's not exactly a slouch. It's also really interestingly styled. I love the exterior styling. The only drawback, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's got a slightly weird four-seater only layout with a huge centre console thing down the middle of it, which divides the left and right hand seats really quite dramatically. And the boot, because of the layout of the motors and the batteries, the boot's about the same size as on a Polo, and it's quite a large car, so the interior space isn't as much as it looks like it will promise. However, it's yours for under £3,000. Looking at Auto Trader today, the entry point into Vauxhall Ampera Life is under £3,000. Obviously there are some for more, but if you want just a cheap way in, there it is. And that is, I'm going to call it as a future classic. It's definitely a future interesting car with future potential for classic status, I think. Incidentally, I think it might have been the next generation on which we didn't get in this country, because the Chevy Bolt did get updated in America, and it had upgradable to full self-driving capabilities and that kind of stuff. But I'm not worried about that. That's not where my interest lies at all. What I am interested in is the fact they did a Cadillac version of it, like a super luxury version of it. And I think that'd be a fascinating thing to import to the UK, although the import duty would be catastrophically bad. Anyway, that was my 10 for the future. And I'll leave you with a bonus number 11. And this is one that is, well, it's very much of the future because the car is still on sale, but Suzuki are about to take their commercial version of the Jimny off sale. And that's going to be the end of the Jimny in the UK. They've already taken the passenger version of the Jimny off sale. It's only been on the market a few years, and it made such a big impact on the world when it came out, because it still did all the fantastic Jimny stuff of being tiny, being absolutely go anywhere, being the best little off-roader it possibly could be. But finally, it drove really nicely on the road. It was brilliant. It did absolutely everything you could ever want in a tiny off-roader, and it looked so good as well, like a tiny little Tonka toy, especially in that brilliant luminous green colour they did. Yeah, but that's no longer available. Emissions rules have basically ruled that one out, which is really sad because I think they're brilliant little cars, and they're really holding the money incredibly well. So if you want something awesome and interesting and different that I think is definitely holding its value well as far as current consumers go, but looking to the future, I think it's going to be worth plenty as well, go and grab yourself a nice little Jimny. Right, these are my current predictions for cars that are going to be classics. Not necessarily high value, because you can never predict the classic car market. It's a roller coaster, but certainly for interest, if nothing else. Nothing as weird as the Fiat Multipla this time, but a few ones I hope make you raise an eyebrow or two. Well, hopefully no more than two, because you've got 3 eyebrows, you've got different problems than what kind of classic car to buy. Anyway, thank you for watching. Let me know what cars you think you should be buying in the future, or I should be buying in the future. And join me again next time, doing something completely different and unusual. When you like, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Head to Fiat Drive and buy a sticker at the Amazon affiliate store to buy some tools. You know the drill. And stay tuned for more car stuff. Goodbye.